I want to move into now at this part. I want to talk about this, what I consider a big idea, and we do 2 of them every week. This week's big idea I'm referring to is the counterintuitive nature of knowledge work. And this is something that I think is really, really important. I don't want to, pigeonhole myself as kind of the mindset guy, but the way that how we see the world and the way we think about the world really determines our behavior, and it determines our success in the world. And the problem is this, and I'm not somebody who discovered this. I just happen to read and pay attention to such things. There was an interview that Dan Kahneman had with Shane Parrish. And if you're not familiar with Shane Parrish, he writes the Farnham Street blog, and it's an amazing website. So I encourage you to do that. I put that link not only in the presentation here, but I put the link in the comments as well, so that you can follow that link to this particular interview that he did. Shane Parrish has a podcast where he interviewed Dan Kahneman. And there's a couple quotes from here that are really, really important to me, and I think are really important to the folks who are paying attention and listening today. What we need, and a lot of what I refer to as agility or the mindset for business agility, is making decisions. And a lot of folks make decisions, especially in business, they go by intuition. And that sometimes is a problem, and nobody's probably studied that more than Kahneman. He's a behavioral economist. He won the Nobel Prize actually for economics with his work with Amos Tversky. And he says, what gets in the way of clear thinking, he calls it clear thinking, sometimes I refer to it as optimal thinking or optimal behavior, is that we have intuitions about almost everything. And so as soon as somebody presents you with a situation or a problem, you've got an answer for it. And that gets in the way of clear thinking, because what happens is we have these ready-made answers, and we form very quick impressions of situations. And then because we have a whole bunch of biases, and one of the most insidious biases we have as human beings is something called confirmation bias. Because of that confirmation bias, we make a decision very quickly on things, and then we look for evidence that confirms that initial intuition. And this is a problem, because a lot of what happens in what I would consider knowledge work, and where I've spent my career, most of my career in software development, which is the epitome of knowledge work, is counterintuitive, meaning that our intuition is often wrong. So Kahneman's advice to CEOs and people in leadership positions, people who make a lot of decisions in business contexts, is that you need to put your intuition on ice. You need to hold back on your intuition. You need to think things through. And it was really interesting when I came across this podcast, because I'm a fan of both Kahneman and Shane Parrish, how it mirrored something I used to say in my training and things that I said with teams and in my coaching practice, which was, if I was ever on the elevator with a C-level executive and I had about 15 seconds to say something that would really matter to them, the thing that I would tell them is, don't trust your intuition. And I felt vindicated when I saw this some years later, and what Kahneman had to say about it, because he is certainly an expert in this and much smarter in this than I am. The interesting thing about intuition is it comes from a lot of different places, but it also comes from our human evolution. And I did a little research into it because I wanted to try to put it into some perspective for you all. Our human brains have evolved over a long period of time. And I did a quick Google search, which we always do, and I found some information on this, and according to science.org, and this jives with what I knew before, 300,000 years ago, the brain size in Homo sapiens fell within the range of present-day humans, and the brain shape continued to evolve, meaning the brain was continuing to evolve until it reached something that was very similar to us, between 100,000 and 35,000 years ago. And why is that important? Well, if you look at how long we have had knowledge work, then, you know, it depends on when you want to start the clock on this. Most people will talk about knowledge work and they'll say it's been in the last maybe 50 to 100 years. So if you take that, and I'm going to take the ones that as estimates, I'm going to take 100 years that we've been knowledge work. You can take 200, doesn't really matter. And I take the number 35,000 years. And if we were to look at it as a calendar year, if we were to compress all human mental brain evolution into a single year, our brains just showed up, knowledge work just showed up on the last day of that year. So you spent most of your brain evolution in a world that was foreign to what I would consider complex knowledge work. So our intuition, our operating system, if you will, our brains, they evolved in a place where complexity, where this concept of VUCA really didn't exist. And because of that, one of the things that we have as human beings, and we all have in common, is we have a huge number of scientifically recognized cognitive biases. And that number sits at, I believe now, over 700. If you're ever really interested in it, there's a Wikipedia page that lists all 700 plus cognitive biases and short descriptions of them. There's some ones that are obviously more important than others, but it's a lot. These are glitches, if you will, or bugs in our operating system, because we evolved in a world not for optimization. We evolved in a world where we just had to be good enough to pass our genetics on to the next thing, because evolution doesn't have an end point. It just says this worked, so we're going to continue to have this in the gene pool. And it's the same with our brain evolution. So we have a lot of things that take us away from objective reality that we can refer to as cognitive biases. And one of those ones that we talked about with Kahneman was this concept of confirmation bias. So when I talk about, so I think we need to be careful. I agree with Kahneman that we have to be careful, that we can't necessarily trust our intuition in this complex world, in this VUCA world. I wanted to give some examples of where we might not be able to trust it, and some examples of what I would consider the counterintuitive nature of knowledge work or software development. And here are some of the ones that I was able to come up with just briefly. And again, this is supposed to just be one big idea. So the big idea here is, put your intuition on ice, because some of the things in our world now, in this world of knowledge work, are counterintuitive. Brooks' law is an example of something that is counterintuitive. Adding people to a late project will only make it later. And this Brooks' law has been around for 50 plus years, I believe now. Another thing that's counterintuitive, I have a good friend of mine and Dan's as well, Llewellyn Falco, who along with others invented something called mob programming. Pair programming, mob programming doesn't make an intuitive sense, especially from a financial standpoint. I remember when I first heard about pair programming, I asked the person, how does this make sense that I'm going to pay two people to do the work of one? Because that's what I thought, because that's where my intuition was. I have since learned that it's much, much different than that. And not only gone from pair programming, but go to mob programming, because it produces more value quickly, which to me is that, kind of Apke's golden rule of agile. Less is more. Often in the world, less is more. When we have fewer choices, it makes it easier. When we have less information, we're less distracted by things that aren't informative. So the best marketing and other things have very simple messages. I know when Dan and I were working as coaches at a company just recently, we were very, very adamant, as was Kyle, who was another guest, of let's keep the message simple. Because if we have too much information, people can be confused. Working more doesn't mean that there's more value delivered. There is no, in the world of knowledge work, there is no correlation between the effort you put into something and the value that it comes out the other end. It's asymmetric, as opposed to something like physical labor, which is where our brains evolved for 35,000 to 100,000 years. That was different. When you're digging ditches, the more effort you put into digging ditches, the more ditches you get at the end, the more value you get at the end. But that doesn't work in our world of knowledge work. We know that knowledge workers are fundamentally motivated differently than physical laborers. And this is the work I cover in my training and some of the stuff from Dan Pink. Carrot and stick are not effective long-term motivations for knowledge workers. Knowledge workers are intrinsically motivated. That is fundamentally different from physical labor, and it's fundamentally different from the world in which our brains evolved. And then one that is really important to me, which is efficiency does not equate to effectiveness, which is very similar to the other ones, but in a sense that efficiency is keeping people busy. Effectiveness is what do we deliver? And they're not the same thing. Again, in a world that's merely physical in nature, being efficient will lead to greater results, but there is no correlation, and sometimes an inverse correlation, in the world of knowledge work. All of these things I would consider to be counterintuitive things. And these are just a few examples. There's many, many more. But as I look at the time, I've run out. So hopefully, just to put a bow around it, it's really important that we realize that the work that we do in knowledge work and software development isn't something that we were built or evolved to understand. We need to kind of put our intuition on ice. We need to think things through a little bit more if we want to be optimal.